So hi there, my name is Ian Turner. So I'm going to talk to you today about research methodologies. And in this talk, when I ask you questions and show you some of the diagrams, I'd urge you to pause the recording to give them due consideration. So I'd like to begin by introducing the research flow, something you're probably quite familiar with, the idea that you identify a research question and ultimately you decide which methods are appropriate to help you identify that research question. But there are some components in between that, such as identifying your position as a researcher and identifying your methodological position. And certainly in my early days of pedagogical research specifically, I'd probably jump from 1 to 4, so straight from research question to think about methods. But I've really come to appreciate that if I understand my own position as a researcher and therefore my methodological position, this really does help me design the best methods and ultimately address the research question in the best way. So what do I mean by positionality? So positionality is a term that, if you haven't come across before, can be quite hard to contemplate. And this quote from Holmes in 2020 says, "The term positionality both describes an individual's worldview and the position they adopt about a research task and its social and political context." So it's about considering yourself, your own position, and how this could influence the research. In order to help you, here are a series of questions about your own positionality in research. And at this point, I'd urge you just to pause the recording and give those questions some consideration. So how did you find them? They're normally quite challenging to do and difficult questions to consider. Perhaps a good way to think about it is to start thinking about where your own positionality lies. So this particular exercise generated by the University of Michigan is called a social identity wheel. And on the diagram, you can see around the outside of the wheel are a whole host of demographic factors such as gender, race, age, etc. And what this wheel asks you to do is to think about your own identities in respect to these different categories. In fact, it asks you a number of questions, such as, which identifiers do you think about the most often in terms of your own positionality? Which one's the least? And which ones of these do you think have a greatest influence? So me, the fact that, I'm, a middle class, white male, are things that probably do influence my own positionality and certainly influence those that I interact with in some of the research questions that I'd like to address. So I'd ask you to pause the recording and use this slide and the previous slide, consider your own identity. So how did you find that one? So now we're going to move on to think about, where does this position actually come from? So there are some key items in the construction and process of a research question. And they're probably best highlighted by this. So we've already talked about the methods, which, just to clarify for me, are the techniques or the procedures you use, which are informed ultimately by the methodology, which for me is the kind of like the strategy or the plan that, links ultimately to your methods and helps you address your kind of research question or your outcome. But that positionality comes from the kind of theoretical perspectives that underpin it. They inform the methodology and provide context for the logic and the criteria which you address. And ultimately, they're driven by two words which you'll become very familiar with as you progress in pedagogic research, where epistemology and ontology, which are all about our theory of knowledge and our view of reality. And they really do underpin those ultimate methodological considerations. So, what comes first on this diagram? Obviously the arrows provide an indication. Natural instinct is often to focus on the methods first and work backwards, but I'd argue that actually it leads to a better project to consider it from left to right rather than right to left. So in order to talk about ontology and epistemology, we need to consider what knowledge is. Bit of a big question for a single slides. So ultimately, knowledge needs to be perceived as objective or subjective. it seems almost reductive to try and condense knowledge down into such simple phrases. So, objective knowledge very arbitrarily is information that's factual, stuff that's based on observation and measurements. So, classically measurements in scientific studies like measurements and things, perhaps things like job appraisals or the outcome of a jury-based trial. So that's what objective knowledge is. Sometimes it's said in another way, so that the meaning, the outcome, exists independently of social actors. Fact is fact almost. Where subjective knowledge is information that's based on personal opinions, judgments, feelings, points of view, stuff that's not directly kind of captured or standardized in any way. So, taste in music, personal opinions on the government, though you could argue that's a bit different nowadays. Views on particular causes or charities, individual, or if you want to put it in the same terms as the other one, or social phenomena are created from perceptions and consequential actions of the social actors themselves. So objective is independent of social actors, whereas subjective knowledge is a consequence of the actions of those social actors. And social actors obviously include us in the world. So the nature of knowledge. And the reason we're talking about the nature of knowledge is the nature of knowledge really does underpin ontology and epistemology. So the two philosophical branches that talk to us about knowledge are these. Ontology is broadly understood as, or described by others at least, as being the study of being, and the nature of reality, and a system of belief that interprets what we constitute the knowledge of reality to be. Whereas epistemology refers more to the procedure used to investigate the problem, to help us understand the knowledge, and whether that's, empirical or logical in how it's grounded. Now, I can tell you that ontology and epistemology are two terms that are very complex and hard to understand the first time you come across them. So I'd urge you that if you're in this bracket to pause this recording, reread these and do some extra reading on understanding these terms before you move forward with the slides. So ontology, what is reality, is sometimes, just to remind ourselves, that's broadly understood as, the study of being and the nature of reality. There are three ontological positions that we could consider here. So the first one at the top, shown by the single circle, is that there's only a single reality or truth, effectively objective. The second reality is that there are multiple different realities, so subjective. And the third one, shown by the magnifying glass, is that reality is constantly kind of negotiated, debated, and interpreted. So you can see the three different positions about what reality is there. In terms of epistemology, once again, there are different approaches to epistemology. The first one is that knowledge can actually be measured. We can find, we can measure the answer. The second one is that we actually need to interpret reality instead. And the third kind of position is we should just use the best tool that's available to us. Sometimes we can measure it. Sometimes we need to interpret it. And we need to adapt that based on what we do. So these kind of positions do help us combine together to help us understand our overall position with our research and help us inform our methodology. So you might be thinking, what on earth does this mean? So I just would like to remind us of this diagram. So the ontology, which is, what's out there to know, plus the epistemology, what and how we know about something, help us inform our methodology, which leads us to our approach about acquiring the knowledge we want to address our research question. Whereas this ultimately helps us inform us the methods. So what exact techniques can I use to go and get that information? Or if that was too much for you, another really good way of thinking about ontology and epistemology is about the idea of research paradigms. So, the combination of an ontological position and an epistemological position, those two, the three different options I gave you in each, can be classed as a research paradigm. And sometimes it's easier to consider what your research paradigm is and then adopt the corresponding ontology and epistemologies. I will say that the difference in terms of ontology and epistemology, in terms of the explanations I've given, is not just semantic. In fact, it's quite easy to find them both defined using the similar set of words. And therefore, I personally find the paradigm approach useful as a good starting point, at least, in understanding why and how knowledge may be constructed in respect to research questions. I mean, I particularly find paradigms useful when carrying out research in teams, considering that before you start. I mean, of course, the research question, is always your primary focus, and a paradigm, may not be possible. But, it's useful to do, especially if there's different paradigms coming at the same project. So some common paradigms are those listed in the blue boxes. So, positivism is the first one, just a single slide here, using the same imagery from earlier on in terms of the ontology and the epistemology slides. And the idea is this is based on a kind of a realist belief in a general set of rules that kind of govern the universe or knowledge, that basically knowledge is created through observation and experiments, and it's very committed to objectivity and highly detailed forms of analysis and the application of logic. Often, but not exclusively, positivism, the data tends to be quantitative. So therefore, the natural science is obviously a model for a positive approach with its focus on a question of objective knowledge or a deductive or theory testing approach. So, how and why things happen using measurements and correlations and statistics. And ultimately, typical methods tend to be things like, surveys and questionnaires and those kind of things. Whereas interpretivism is more based on a relativist belief that experience is subjective and words are individually or socially constructed, and that knowledge is created through a compilation of those experiences and an analysis of individual stories and communication. As a result, data tends to be qualitative in nature, and not exclusively, of course, and involves things like text and oral transcripts and other forms of descriptive data like photographs. It arises from a critique of the natural sciences as a model, much more common in social research. So it's a question of subjective knowledge in this case, and an inductive or theory building approach. So it's trying to understand how and why things happen and elucidate meaning from stuff. And often things like focus groups and interviews are common methods used here. So, that's two broad categories in positivism and interpretivism. And this slide here creates a summary of the two different approaches, which I'd ask you to pause and look at alongside the pros and cons of these two different techniques, which I won't go through here. I will just cover one final research paradigm, and that's pragmatism. So pragmatism is an approach that suggests there's different ways of interpreting the world and undertaking research. And actually, by combining different approaches, we're probably going to get a much broader and more an enhanced understanding of the original research question that we're interested in. So pragmatism involves research that design includes research as operational kind of decisions focused on what will be best now in finding the answers to the questions. And by being pragmatic, you can be more dynamic in finding solutions to individual research problems. So a pragmatic study focuses on an individual decision maker within the real world situation, and considers a process of undertaking, the broadest context, and considering multiple methods, some which may be familiar to them, some may be less familiar to them, and pragmatically combines these methods, in order to best address the research question. So I like pragmatism as an approach. I find it very useful, and I'll probably call myself a pragmatist in most cases. It's got a range of different strengths. They can be easy to describe and report. They can be useful when you get an unexpected result from a prior study because tackling it with a range of different approaches. I find they can be really helpful to help you generalize data. I find they can be really helpful in designing and validating an instrument. More broadly, I find it useful. It helps me, develop a much more holistic analysis, to incorporate a range of, different factors into my study. Including things like time and discrepancies. Of course, like all techniques, there are some limits, with any research paradigm, in terms of, the time it takes to conduct can be much more time consuming. And one particular thing is the order and proceeding if you're using a range of approaches, which I'll cover with the last few slides. So the last couple of slides, I just want to finish off by bringing in methodology, which is not the focus of this talk particularly, but it's worth just rounding off here. If you just look at the interpretive / positivist kind of divide that we did originally, one thing that's worth considering in methodology is that often, the sample, the approach is very different between these two research paradigms. Then I know the numbers can change rapidly, but often in the positivist approach, the measurement approach, the aim is much higher. 500 questionnaires, samples, 500 readings, whereas in the interpretive approach, the aim can be much lower, 10 interviews, 5 focus groups in terms of number. And that's worth considering when you consider your, ultimately your research method. And research methods, which are not the focus of this talk, can be classed as quantitative and qualitative. And of course, mixed methods, which is a combination of both those. And, in terms of pragmatism, my favorite approach, which often involves mixed methods and quantitative and qualitative, the sequencing of those two approaches, which comes first, which comes second, or you do them concurrently, and which one is worth more. Which one do you value them equally in terms of your analysis, or do you value one higher than the other? Are really important considerations and could be a limitation of the pragmatism approach. So my final slide is simply this. What does this mean? So what does all this mean in the context of my own individual research question? And only that's a question that only you can answer. Thanks.